So this impacts diabetes, heart transplant, for example, where you can better choose the drugs that would impact rejection. And I'll talk a minute about treatment-resistant depression, which I think is a particularly interesting application. This is the computer screen you would see, or you might see if you were doing what's called a SNP analysis, single nucleotide polymorphism analysis. It's the way that genetic markers are identified these days. And so let's assume that you have a situation involving depression. 5 to 10% of adults suffer from depression, which causes quality of life issues and vast economic consequences. 2/3 of patients with major depression disorder fail therapy. With this kind of SNP analysis, we can identify gene variants impacting brain neurochemistry and improve treatment. The same is true for cancer and even for things like substance addiction. The genetic basis for substance addiction, for example, nicotine, is now becoming well understood. This is an example of a paper published by an Icelandic company that I'm involved in with colleagues where that work was done. A couple things on the biotech industry. Again, attackers are beating incumbents. New companies are beating old traditional companies like Pfizer, Bristol Myers, and Lilly. You can see here that the 5 major U.S. pharmaceutical companies have significantly lost market cap, while the biotech industry has gained market cap over time. It's an industry that also consumes a lot of capital, and just back in the 80s, when IDEXX was started, for example, only a few $billions per year in total in the United States were invested in venture capital. Those numbers are now $25 to $30 billion per year. So all of this is, one of the interesting things about this is this convergence between these two technologies. Information technology and biological technology are converging to create a historic sea change in healthcare by combining genomics, proteomics, systems biology, evolutionary biology with mobile applications, telemedicine, very advanced computing power, and a whole new generation of interesting electronic devices. So in the future, if you need to monitor cholesterol, glucose, heart arrhythmias, blood pressure, sleep, medication compliance, or other things, there will be an app for that. Let me just talk a minute about public policy. Science, the success of these revolutionary, transformative, large industry sectors is highly influenced by public policy. Science and technology, economies and business create great value, so people want to get involved. Countries want to get involved. Investors, entrepreneurs want to get involved. So global competitiveness is very intense. Winning in states, in countries, and for individual companies is highly influenced by public policy. The U.S. position is strong but eroding. The key factors are obviously R&D investment and education. This slide shows R&D investments, expenditures for the United States for the last 10 years or so against Asian economies and Europe. You can see that in this period of time, about a little over 10 years, U.S. R&D investment increased from $200 billion to now approaching $400 billion, so a doubling. Most of that investment is industry investment. About 2/3 of it is private investment, but the 1/3 that is government is crucially important, and we know that from the genome sequencing project, from the invention of the internet, and from many, many other applications. The federal R&D budget is driven really by 3 things: by security, by healthcare, and by energy policy. Everything else is small. These dominate that agenda. If we look, though, at R&D expenditures and as a share of economic output, as a share of gross domestic product, you can see that the U.S. is pretty static at 2.5% of GNP, while China is growing very rapidly, and some countries like Japan are spending more than we are already. This slide looks at average annual growth of R&D expenditures over a 10-year period of time. You can see that the United States is growing at about 5%, while Asian countries driven by China are growing at over 20% per year. So very significant differences in growth rate there. You can also measure competitiveness and innovation by some other things, one of which is the publishing of science and engineering articles. You can see that the United States leads that field, but others are gaining very rapidly. Another measure of competitiveness and innovation is granting of patents. The United States dominates that market, others also growing. High-tech manufacturing, still another measure where the U.S. is relatively flat in terms of value-added share, while Japan has declined dramatically and China is growing. So average annual growth rates in research is another measure of competitiveness and so forth. Again, the Asian countries growing very rapidly while the United States is growing at about 2%. And of those, foreign degree holders play a very important role in the U.S. economy. Foreign degree holders represent a third to a half of the degree holders, the degree getters in U.S. institutions, and that's increasing. Looking at this geographically in the United States, technology and science-based businesses are very clustered. This shows it by state. If we were to look at it by city, it would be even more concentrated in Boston, San Francisco, San Diego, and a couple of other countries, cities. But you can see that Maine is in the lowest quartile here, also in the lowest quartile of science and engineering occupations. The best example of clustering is Massachusetts. Was once called Beantown. It's now known as Genetown, and it's an amazing concentration of high-tech horsepower. So let me finish up here, possibly a little bit late, but again, there's the snowstorm factor. We may not be going anywhere, and talk about success factors that may be relevant to people in the room, based on my experience in now getting involved in more than a dozen startups directly. I've shown Steve Jobs as sort of the poster boy for the kind of DNA that you'd like to have in an organization. He's sort of the Michael Jordan of the high-tech world. Larry Ellison, the CEO of Oracle Computer, said of Jobs that he has the mind of an engineer and the heart of an artist. And that kind of DNA is crucial to success in this business. So what are some of the key success factors? Building an exceptional team, including the board and investors, is the most important factor. Nothing else comes close. You want an organization and a team that has missionary versus mercenary passion. You want an adventurous group that has a high willingness to experiment and take risks and sometimes fail. The observation there is attitude is far more important than skill, and as Einstein said once, imagination is more important than knowledge. You need to populate these companies to be successful with game-changing, rebel, breakthrough mentality type people who believe that the conventional wisdom is always wrong. You need people with a pervasive curiosity and a love of discovery. Someone defined discovery to me recently as seeing what other people have seen, but thinking what no one else has thought.